All right, so in chapter 7, what we're going to get into is a really applied aspects of many of the things that we've been talking about so far this semester, and particularly about communication. Next lecture, we'll talk about negotiation, but communication is really how things get done in organizations. And so when some people have certain values and another group doesn't have those same kind of values, it really hits kind of nail on the head as far as how um, disorganized and or how goals could miss their kind of essence and core. And communication is a big part of making sure that we don't miss our kind of shared goals and aims when we're in an organization. So what we're going to do in this lecture, talk about what communication is and define it exactly, because we talk about it all the time, but we don't really define it. And then look at upward and downward communication, and look at a little bit of um, what kind of different styles different cultures tend to have. Okay, so let's start with communication definition. It's really straightforward. It's transferring meaning. That's what communication is. And in almost all cases, it's from the sender to the receiver. You have to transfer what's in your head and get it to go into someone else's head. So that seems really straightforward. However, what we realize, if you've ever been in a relationship, ever been in a serious work situation or context, you understand there's so many problems that can occur with communication that it's incredibly hard to transfer meaning. And this model here that I have, I think it sort of shows in a nutshell why communication is so difficult. So, in a nutshell, what we have here is that something is in the head of the sender, and they actually have to turn it into words, because the thoughts that are in our head aren't thoughts that can be written down or are words. Um, they are images and abstract qualities. And so in our head, we have to turn what we're thinking, which is not words, into words before we even say anything or write anything. So that's the first kind of really difficulty in communication, is in our own heads. We have to turn these thoughts into words. And we can mess up a great deal when we do that. We can say the wrong words. We can not be smart enough to know how to say what we're thinking. We could um, not be as eloquent as we should. We could say way too much and confuse people. There's just tons of things that can happen. And then, so once we actually say or write the things that we want to say, we have to pick a channel for it. So we may do it over email. We may do it in a public lecture, like what I do. We may do it um, in a conversation with someone else. You may do it in a memo that's written and then hung on the wall. There's all kinds of different ways. But while you're doing the communication through a channel, you could also mess up. You could say too much. You could write too much. You could write the wrong word. You could confuse people with what you're saying. If you've ever texted anyone, which I'm sure you have, you know how easily it is to get text misconstrued. So we could sort of have that sort of thing going on. Now, then the receiver has to kind of get that message and read it. So if I'm giving a lecture and you're looking at someone else in the room, you're not focused exactly on what I'm saying, so you're kind of hearing maybe half of what I'm saying, and that can make you understand in a much different way than someone who's really focused on what I'm saying. Or if someone sends in a text and to a group chat, and this really not doesn't involve you, or maybe it's somebody that you don't like, you just kind of skip over it or skim it, where somebody else might read it and really focus on it. There's so many different ways that people can receive a message. And then the last step is that even once you receive it, once you hear it, like in my class, or you hear it on this online lecture, or you receive a text and you read it, you have to transfer it into images and uh, abstract qualities that your brain can comprehend and embed. So our brains don't remember words, they remember abstract ideas and images. And so Anytime you receive a message, whether it's oral or written or any other way, we have to decode it back into our brain. So that's the 5 steps that we have here, and every single one of them has a chance to really misfire. So if you hear people say, "Oh, we can't communicate," or "You can't communicate with me," or people get in a fight over communication, it should be easy to communicate. Absolutely not. That's not the case. Communication is incredibly hard. Okay, so with that being said, the reason that it's important for this class for us to talk about it is because context is so important in communication because it helps convey the message. And what we realize is that certain cultures, context plays a huge role, and in other cultures, it doesn't play a role at all, which makes context always important. You have to know whether you're in a culture that has messages that are very high context, which are highly coded and implicit, which are Japanese cultures and Arab countries, versus uh, a context that's very low oriented, which means that people say exactly what they want to say and how they say it, which is what we do in our culture, what we're used to. So this is actually, communication is actually very difficult. Many of the values that we've been talking about being successful in businesses, um, Americans have kind of had an upper hand on an advantage, but what we see when we talk about communication, we haven't. It's much different. So in this way, when we look at high context versus low context, we look at low context cultures when people say what it is that they want to say and what they want to mean. Germans and Scandinavians and North Americans are kind of all down here in this area that they say what they want to mean, and context plays less of a role. And as we move up into Italians, Latins, Arabs, and Asians, we won't just say Japanese. We'll throw most Asians in the bunch there. Latin Americans, Arabs, and Japanese, they don't say what they want to say. Now, it's very difficult for us to comprehend, but that's the case. So we're going to dive into here a little bit more about how that happens. So what high context cultures do, and high context cultures are like those Arab cultures and Asian cultures, they use ways to communicate that don't necessarily have to do with the meaning of the words that they're saying. So when you're in a high context culture, it's much more indirect. The way you say something matters more than what you say. What your face looks like when you say it matters more than what you say. The timing of what you say matters more than what you say. Your expression and your bodily image when you say something matters more than what you say. That's very difficult than low context cultures like North Americans, where people kind of say exactly what they want to say. They're very direct, and when you meet in a group to kind of talk about things, you meet in order to serve a purpose, in order to accomplish objectives. That's not how it is in high context cultures. When we talk about high context cultures, what we can also see is the amount of words that people are saying matters so much. So in high context cultures, you have two different types of amount of words that are different than Americans' exacting style. So North Americans tend to have an exacting style. We say just the right amount of words in order to get our point across and to say what it is that we want to say. High context cultures do the opposite or different than that. They either say tons of words, which is what Latin Americans tend to do, Arab cultures tend to do. They tend to talk a lot and say a lot of words. And that's a high context culture. But also other high context cultures like Asian cultures tend to say very little words, tend to say hardly anything, and have tons of understatements, pauses, and silences. So that's a succinct style. That elaborating style is more of the Latin and Arab style. And then our exacting style that we have, that we're used to, is when you say exactly what it is that you want to say in the right amount of words. Now, another way that verbal communication differs is contextual and personal styles. So contextual styles focus on the speaker, okay, in that the relationship really drives everything. Again, this is not something that we're used to. Whether we're talking to our boss our supervisor, or someone who has the same job as us, we tend to say things the exact same way. That's not how people in a high context style do. Depending on who it is they're talking to, they say things very differently. If you're talking to your boss, you say one thing's a completely different way than you're talking to someone who's a subordinate to you or below you. That's not how it is in kind of low context cultures like North America, like the one that we have, where people have a very personal style and say everything kind of the same way depending on who it is. So we don't change up what we're going to say too much based on who it is that we're talking to. Now, an affective style versus an instrumental style. In an affective style, what we see is that people have to observe what it is that people are saying, kind of their emotions and their nonverbal aspects, in order to decipher the true meaning of a message. So, for instance, in Asian cultures, you don't really tell somebody that they did poorly on something or that they failed an exam. So, as a professor, one of the things when I talk to my Chinese students, I have to kind of still be nice to them and say they kind of did well, but also let them know with that I'm not giving them effusive praise. I'm not looking them in the eye. I'm kind of beating around the bush. That lets them know they need to do better. Not telling them that they need to do better, which is embarrassing, and kind of it affects their face, so to speak. Instrumental style is a much less emotional version of that. This is what our culture tends to do. We tend to be goal oriented and focus on what needs to be done. And I let my students know if you come to ask me how you did on the test compared to other people, I'm going to let you know you either did better, worse, or about the same as everybody else. I'm not really worried about hurting your feelings because you're not really going to get your feelings hurt knowing the truth in that sort of way. So that's kind of the effect of an instrumental style. Now, the big picture here, the reason that we're interested in all this is because when people get together in an organization, especially a multinational corporation, you have to be on the same page as far as what people are trying to say and how they're trying to say it. So having shared meaning, understanding why people are doing what it is they're doing is more important than what they actually say. So to Americans, what people say is more important than kind of how they say it. But in many other cultures, that meaning is not transferred. You don't understand the real reason that organizations form and the goals that they are trying to seek unless meaning is shared, and that is where communication comes in. So if I think you mean something different than what the person sitting next to me thinks, then effective communication has not occurred. We have to get everybody to be on the same page when we're working in an organization and essentially share meaning of what's being said, and that can be done in a lot of different ways. So downward communication is a flow and is a direction that communication occurs. So when we have downward communication, it's essentially from a manager to a subordinate, or sort of like this class, from the professor to the student. And generally, the primary purpose of this sort of communication is to convey orders or to convey information, what people need to do, or why they need to do it, or what's kind of important. And then managers kind of give instructions and tell people how they've been doing too, not just what they need to do. But for instance, I give you feedback based on your test grades or your group grades or those sorts of things. And so what we found with downward communication is that Americans tend to be pretty good at it. Americans tend to be able to tell people that are their subordinates how and why they need to get the job done. So this is not something that our culture tends to have a problem with. Other cultures that kind of tend to be more careful with how they say things. Managers may be not as good with downward communication. But for the most part, for organizations to work, Downward communications is not a problem. It's just that I need to talk about downward communication in order to contrast it with this next one, upward communication, which is something that Americans tend to be really poor at, and that's where subordinates talk up to their superior. And this is when you tell your manager how you're doing, what you're spending your time on, where you might need assistance, how things are going. And what we find is that Americans are really poor at this. This is something that Asian cultures simply are much, much, much better at. They're constantly communicating with their bosses and telling people what it is that they've been getting done and how they've been doing it and where they might need help. This is something that, for a number of reasons, Americans tend to think that we're kind of bragging if we say that we've done something, or it kind of suggests that we don't understand what we're doing if we ask for help. All these sorts of things. So there's really been a call for more upward communication in American life, in American organizational life. This is an epigram I kind of wanted to put in. I thought it was a really interesting. It's sort of the difference between American organizations, Chinese organizations, and then we'll see French and the French organizations, and then also throw in the UN. American organizations tend to be somewhat flatter, but essentially everybody has a direct route to the CEO. No matter who you are, you feel like you can talk to the CEO. That's not the case with Chinese organizations. What you see is that people are much more hierarchical, and if you're at the bottom, you only talk to this person. You don't have a direct route to the CEO up here like Americans do. And so it's very orderly and driven. And that's another reason why upward and downward communication kind of differs, because these people are only communicating with one other person. So the types of communication that's occurring, it's really only occurring with one other person. Whereas in American organizations, a lot of different people are talking to a lot of different people in the organization. So it kind of gets thrown out of whack. We see United Nations is very circular in the sense that there's no leader, there's no person in charge, and so people talk to the people next to them, and it's kind of a circular hierarchy in that way. And then French culture, this is just to kind of illustrate that French culture is less organized. Like these people here may talk to these people kind of more informally, and these people here may not be really connected to each other when they should be. The CEO's kind of off on their own planet, and they're not really talking to a lot of people, and that's kind of that's something that wouldn't really work here in the United States, but it's something that European models adopt. Now, I wanted to bring up Proverbs because they're not necessarily nonverbal communication, but what they do is they get across values of a country by saying in a very quick sentence sort of a truth that the culture believes. And so, there's kind of different truths for different cultures, but all cultures have proverbs that have their values represented. And when you travel to different countries, one of the things that I always tell people, if you travel to a different country and you really want to learn about that country's values, their culture, the very best, easiest, quickest way to be able to kind of do that is to look up the proverbs in that country. So when you look up American proverbs and you see something like "Don't cry over spilled milk" or "Time is money," you start to understand how practical and thrifty Americans tend to be, how a penny saved is a penny earned, how hard work is important. So something like early to bed, early to rise makes one healthy, wealthy, and wise. How we are a country that values hard work, values time, everything turns into money. Time is money. That sort of a thing. That kind of phrase, "time is money," that is a very rare phrase you'll find in other cultures. Most other cultures would actually kind of find that sickening for us to say, but that's what makes us Americans. That's what makes us who we are and our values. So if you were to go to other countries and read their proverbs, you might find some very, very different ones that could inform you very quickly of the values that country has. Now, turning to truly nonverbal communication, we're going to talk about things that you don't say that still communicate something. So things. First thing is chromatics, like color. In different cultures, colors mean certain things. So in our culture, if we say someone's blue, it means that they're sad. Or if we say someone's yellow, it means that they're kind of afraid. Or someone's red, it kind of means that they're angry. If someone wears white, we say that it's probably a wedding. If you're dressed up in a really a nice white gown or outfit, or if you're dressed up in black, uh, then you're in mourning. So chromatics mean certain things in different cultures, and so the color red in China means it's the good luck color. It's the color that means money. And you go to different cultures and you see that exact same thing in different ways. So purple is a color of Lent. It's in between when Mardi Gras ended and Easter, and it's a time that Catholics tend to have focus on mourning and giving up something. So purple's not seen as in certain cultures as a really positive color. So these are all things that we want to know that have other ways of communicating information. And then kinesics is when we communicate through our body. So eye contact, this is a really good one to think about. In some cultures, you don't make eye contact the same way that you do in American culture. In American culture, we look at someone straight in the eyes, and when we're telling them something, that's very important. That means, hey, I'm gonna get this done, or I'm a person that you can be trusted. In cultures such as Asian cultures, looking someone in the eyes, it's not what you do if you're a subordinate. If I'm a subordinate, I don't look you in the eye because you're better than me. You're in a better position than me. So if I come in for a job interview and I'm a subordinate, I'm a lower position, I'm not going to give you eye contact. And in fact, eye contact is very important in American culture when you're doing a job interview. So other things like posture and gestures, how you stand relative to someone, is very important. So that has to do with kind of proxemics, which are how physical space determines a message. So um, in all cultures, we sort of see that how close you stand to someone sort of conveys some sort of information. So if I get, and this is American culture here, if I get within 18 inches of you, if I get really, really close to you, that means something either really, really good or really, really bad. Your friends don't even stand that close to you. So when you get that close, it's something a little bit different. And the personal distance is sort of a foot and a half to 3 feet or 4 feet, and that's where you're kind of gonna, uh, your friends are gonna stand. Maybe you're standing in line to some degree, but it's kind of like if you're ever standing in line and someone gets within kind of 2 feet or 3 feet of you, you're sort of like, hey, what's going on here? Um, in the United States, it's very uncommon to get that close to someone. And then we have sort of a social distance and then a public distance where people feel comfortable. What we find in Asian cultures is that people stand further away from each other than they do in the United States. And then in Latin cultures, people stand much closer to people. So a personal distance in Latin culture is much closer. So if you were to wait in a line, let's say, and you were in South America, you would find people would get really close to you, uncomfortably close for American standards. Um, and this last sort of nonverbal communication that I want to talk about is chronemics, and this is essentially how you view time. Time is something that's very subjective. It's something that is only used kind of when we're really thinking about it, and when we think about it, um, Americans tend to use it in a linear fashion. We don't really think, oh, I can do multiple things at the exact same time while I'm at work. When we multitask, it's like, okay, I'm going to do this, and then also I'll do this in a second. But in other cultures, what you sort of see is that people don't view time as kind of as linear as we view it. They're kind of they're moving forward and backwards in time, and they also don't value a schedule, a thing to do. I think I've told you guys before, but it's like if you're having a really good conversation with your boss, but you have a meeting that you have to leave for, in a polychronic culture, you won't leave that meeting with the boss. You'll continue to talk to the boss because that's the person that employed you. That's the important relationship that you need to have. And you'll get to that other meeting when you get to it. In our culture, this monochronic kind of view, you would tell your boss, "Hey, I have another meeting," and they would understand. They would understand that you have somewhere else that you need to go, even though it's not as important as them. You've already scheduled it. You said you would be there, and time is linear in that way.